Yes, I'm a lecturer in economics. I haven't ever been a computer scientist, although I have done various things with computers, as I'm sure you'll see. I run the study called Mappiness, which I'm sure that a few of you at least have heard of. And I've described the background to this in the original research question, which is about natural environments and happiness. Feels like a lot of times over the last few years. So today I'm going to try and get that over with in the first half, and then I'm going to talk about sort of several other ongoing applications of this data set that are still about happiness, but provide new lines of evidence on some other topics. And in a way, this is an excuse for not having anything finished that's exciting enough to take 20 minutes talking about. So the background, what's Mappiness for? Well, here's some green space. I'm sure we all agree that green space is lovely. It makes us feel good. But the question really is just how lovely is green space? This quote from Kelvin at the beginning today was apposite here. You know, we know it's lovely, but we'd like to put numbers on how lovely it is. And that's actually important for various kinds of things. You know, policymakers recently started talking about selling off all the forests in the UK, for example. Well, we think that's crazy, but just how crazy is that? Can we give them some numbers that tell them just how crazy that is? We weren't in time to do that, but they changed their minds anyway, so that was a good thing. So certainly that's good for policymakers. It's good if you're trying to satisfy Kelvin. Some people hate this idea that you can put numbers on this kind of thing. And actually one thing that we could have for a tagline for Mappiness these days is it's as slated by Archbishop Rowan Williams, who came on Radio 4 at some point last year and said that to rate your happiness on a scale of 1 to 10 is a joke. But to date, the evidence on this question, how lovely green space is, has been a little bit thin. So that's the question really. Green space is lovely, and we're going to measure that by saying, well, how much happier are people in natural environments? And there's this whole ongoing debate in economics about subjective well-being measures, which I won't get into, but you could quiz me on later. But suffice to say, this is a sort of semi-legitimate question, at least in economics these days. So in science and medicine, in terms of the evidence, people have done various kinds of experimental studies, taking people into the forest, showing them slides of natural scenes, measuring how they feel before, asking them how they feel afterwards, for example. And that's nice in that you can control for lots of things, but it has very little ecological validity because, you know, in people's day-to-day lives, they don't spend time looking at slides of natural environments in lab settings. It doesn't tell you a lot about how people feel in their everyday lives. Economists have generally done observational studies instead, so they've looked at sort of countrywide average happiness and sort of some measure of countrywide average environmental quality. SWB there is subjective well-being and EQ is environmental quality. Or they've looked at the individual level and asked them about their well-being nowadays and the environment close to where they live. And there are problems with both of those things. With countries particularly, you know, lots of environmental quality things actually vary over the space of tens of meters, you know, say air pollution, for example. There is a paper that looks at national mean air pollution and national mean well-being, and I don't find that all that convincing. With individuals, it's a little bit better, but there are a huge number of confounding factors, other things that vary close to people's homes, and it's also not at all clear that that's the most important location of environmental exposure, right? Your commute is probably very important, your workplace is probably very important, all kinds of other places are important. So there are also limitations with this individual level data. And so that got me thinking, well, actually, wouldn't it be a really nice, new, direct approach to this to say, how do you feel right now, and what environment are you in right now? So to kind of drill down, not countries, not individuals, but actually the individual experiences of individual people. That would give us really direct data on this question of the link between environment and happiness. There are several kinds of happiness, and I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but the previous approaches at national or individual level tend to look at either evaluative happiness, which is a sort of a general, you know, give me a number from 1 to 10 that represents your satisfaction with life as a whole. In fact, that's what they tend to look at. There are other happiness concepts. The eudaimonic happiness concept is about sort of how much you feel there's meaning and purpose and worthwhileness in what you do. And then the third concept, and the concept that we kind of need to use here, if we're looking at individual moments, is the more hedonic or affective concept, which is about your current feelings, essentially, your current emotions, your current feelings, because those are the things that we can sensibly ask about several times a day, right? Those are the things that kind of move up and down. If we asked you how satisfied you were with your life several times a day, you'd give us a few very similar answers, and then you'd get fed up and not answer anymore, because the answers wouldn't change a lot. Studies that look at people's momentary experiences, people's momentary feelings in that way, have been done before. In fact, they've been done since at least the 70s. And psychologists call it the experience sampling method. In medicine, they call it ecological momentary assessment, where ecological is sort of the same as in ecological validity rather than nice natural environments. In the past, people have handed out notebooks or PDAs. They've beeped people at random moments, and they've asked about the experience and the context of that experience. And one thing they find actually when they check this is that sometimes even a majority of people's answers are falsified when you do it with the old technology. A large number of people fill in all the answers at the beginning of the study or at the end of the study when they send it back. So this has been done before, but it hasn't been done for the environment. Oh, and I have a point to make before that. Why is ESM nice? We don't get any recall bias, so you ask people how they're feeling right now, and in principle that should be kind of accessible to them right now without a lot of kind of evaluation, weighting, summing, and so on. So it should be accurate, it should be detailed, and also we get panel data. So we can use fixed effects, we can take out all the within-person variation, we don't get confounded by unobserved individual level characteristics, how people use the response scale, personality types, and so on. And we can also make sure that we're not being confounded by certain kinds of people being found in certain environments because we're using only the within-person variation. This hasn't been done before. So this was during my PhD, and this is the iPhone launched at this period. And iPhone's a sort of perfect tool for taking this experience sampling method and applying it a bit more broadly. As these pictures tell us, it's got GPS, as we know. It's got a microphone for sound. We can send data back. We can make it go bing. We can present a short survey. We can take pictures. Millions of people have these already. And so that was this idea behind Mappiness. Now, you might spot that there's a big problem with using phones, and other people have alluded to this in their talks, which is, iPhone owners are on average young, rich, educated, and possibly self-satisfied, and they have to self-select into the study too. And then once they've self-selected into the study, they have to be able and willing to respond to each beep. So sampling is a big problem. It's probably the number one drawback of this approach. And again, you can grill me on that later if you want. But let's for now just say that I'm probably Justin Long here on the right, and I want to take part in the study. So I can download the app for free from the App Store, and that's still true, so if anyone wants to take part in Mappiness, I won't think you're rude if you start looking at your phones now. Search for Mappiness in the App Store. Once I've downloaded it, I spend less than 5 minutes sort of agreeing to some privacy and terms and conditions. I answer a few demographic questions. I confirm how often I'm going to be beeped. And then twice a day I get beeped, much like getting a text. And I respond on a variety of questions. And so I say how happy, how relaxed, and how awake I am. I'm just going to talk about the happy responses here. I think I'm imagining I'm in a pub at the moment, so I'm going to be socializing and drinking alcohol. And even Andy, with his professed attention span of a goldfish, might manage to do a survey of this sort because it really only does take 20 seconds. And while I'm answering, the GPS is getting my location, and all my data is being sent back. And I can look at some of the data as a sort of a reward. I can see some very simple aggregates. I can also download all my data if I'm in that kind of quantitative self kind of mood and see it in various kinds of forms. I actually think that one of the most valuable things for people is just to be asked regularly, and they kind of develop an intuitive sense of when they're happy and what they spend time doing and so on. I can then download the data. I can see it on a map. I can subscribe to it in iCal and so on. It's going to show me that now. So we can see where I've taken pictures. I think this is a slightly self-referential slide. I can also look on the public website to see how people are happy, how people are feeling in general right now, and how they've been feeling over the past week, both across the whole country and in London. And I can see the public map, which shows us where people have been feeling happy lately. The project got some really good media coverage. And that was really useful for recruiting a lot of people, which was my main worry with this. I'd get a couple of dozen people giving me a couple of dozen responses, but that didn't turn out to be a problem. This was less useful than it might have been because it was a UK study, and Le Figaro is a big newspaper, but it's not in the UK. But it's still very big news at drive time on the radio and in papers that Tuesday is ever so slightly more depressing than Monday, even after we've controlled for bank holidays. So lots of news coverage, and that means that we, as of now, have over 3.5 million responses from 60,000 people. This is a map of the number of responses that we had, sort of, I think, within only the first month. And it's a logarithmic scale, so light grey is really rather few, but dark black is a lot. And so we have reasonable geographical coverage. This looks somewhat like a population density map. It shouldn't look exactly like a population density map because it's where people are, not where they live. But this is pretty good. This is a sort of this is some descriptive data which actually recalls one of the charts that we saw earlier today. But this is a whole year's worth of average happiness data for Mappiness users in the UK. And we have all the days of the year, I think from the 1st of September to the 31st of August, 2010 to 2011, are kind of each horizontal line. And then going from the left to the right, we go from 8 AM at the morning to 10 PM at night. That's the period where by default we beat people, so we have plenty of data. And you can get a whole lot of things from the patterns here. So firstly, it's sort of stripy, and that's because people like weekends a lot more than they like weekdays. So the light colours are happier, the dark colours are less happy. And the stripiness tells us that weekends are good. The two particularly bright stripes are Christmas Day, and generally the Christmas holidays, and also the sort of the April-May bank holidays. At some point here there was a royal wedding, I think, which is a particularly bright spot, annoyingly for Republicans. And you can also see that the colour gets gradually lighter towards the right as well. Most people are not morning people. On average, happiness sort of climbs throughout the day. You can also see it's a little bit noisier towards the end of the period because we had more people taking part at the beginning when we were featured in the App Store, and so on. So my main interest was in links between happiness and the immediate environment. And so I joined habitat data with each response. This is the land cover map 2000. I'm now using the land cover map 2007, but it's the same idea. And this is a sort of high-resolution, remote-sensed land cover data set. It tells us about habitat type. This is London, as you might have spotted. And so black areas are continuous urban land cover. You can see the Thames in blue, Hyde Park up here. Is made of sort of trees and grass and water. So this isn't just about kind of urban versus rural, it's just about the land cover in that specific location where somebody is. And so all of this data, the data that they've responded, spatial data that we've joined with it, goes into one big model trying to predict people's reported happiness. And we scale that slider so that the far left is 0 and the far right is 100. And then we put in sort of everything in that one model. So we have individual fixed effects, so we're using only within individual variation. And then we have the habitat type. We have weather conditions and daylight, because they obviously might affect mood and what people choose to do, what they're doing, who they're with, what kind of place they're in, the time of day of the week, and how many responses they've given before, because people's responses get actually significantly happier over time, which I guess is a good thing. And so to give us a sort of sense of scale, these are the happiest activities that people do. The top activity was added subsequently after many email requests as a question of who's looking over people's shoulder while they're filling this one in, I guess. But that's by far the happiest. But most of the other activities are sort of about 6 points out of 100 happier than not doing them. And the little the error bars there are 95% confidence interval. So these are very significant coefficients. These are the coefficients in the regression. And generally those happy activities are sort of physical or cultural kinds of activities. The least happy activities, we don't like being in bed. We don't like waiting and queuing and so on. So for a nation that likes to wait and queue, we don't like to wait and queue very much. But that gives some context then to the environmental findings, which were my main interest at the beginning. And we find that all kinds of natural environments are happier than a continuous urban environment, particularly this marine and coastal margin environment, which is sort of estuaries and wetlands. It's not just any coast, it's sort of estuaries and wetlands. Although I haven't got any coast in there as a variable, and I probably really should soon. Particularly being at Sussex, I know the press office there would like it if I did. In the meantime, they'll just interpret marine and coastal margins as being the beach. So that seems nice. So it's a powerful new line of evidence on links between environment and happiness. We know that we're not confounded because certain people go to certain places. There is still a question of causality. Maybe I become happy and for that reason I go to the beach, or maybe I become sad and for that reason I go to the park to cheer myself up. And we should be able to address some of that by looking at the kind of sequencing of events, and I haven't done that yet. There's lots more to be done on this. A couple of obvious things are that we don't control for where people live. So, most of our respondents live in cities, and part of the effect might be that there's a change in the environment. That's an obvious thing that should be controlled for that so far isn't. But this does sort of stand up to various other kinds of robustness tests, and you can read more in Global Environmental Change. So that was the original research question and analysis, but then the question here is sort of what else can be done with data of this sort. And the terms and conditions when you sign up to Mappiness just state that this can be used only for academic research and will never try to identify anybody or allow anyone else to try to identify anybody. But the fact that we have time and location and multiple responses per person, and these are volunteered responses, so in that sense hopefully it's sort of potentially less creepy than some other kinds of big data we have on people. gives us quite a lot of interesting options in terms of other research questions. We can do interesting kinds of joins with other data that vary over time and space. And so I'm going to talk about 4 additional questions that sort of get increasingly complex. A couple of things that I may have mentioned, weather, air quality and alcohol, I'm leaving out for reasons of time, but I'll talk about 4 different questions that I've been addressing with this data. So the first one has a title, Are You Happy While You Work? This is with Alex Bryson at LSE and NICER, I never know how to say their name. Are you happy while you work? Well, I kind of almost wish that, I think there is a paper in the literature where the abstract is one word and the word is no, and that would have been a good abstract for this paper. So the short answer is no, you're not happy while you work, and the long answer is no, you're not happy while you work, and in fact, you independently dislike working, being at work, being with your colleagues, and the working day. So everything about work is a bit disastrous. We also look at some other things, such as what activities people combine with work and what difference sort of that sort of thing makes. So, for example, I can reveal that 0.3% of people are singing or performing while they work, taking Snow White's advice here. And it's a shame it's not more, because actually if you're singing or performing while you work, that almost cancels out the negative effect of working. Obviously, this is complicated and interesting. But it's certainly complicated. I haven't really mentioned any of the complications, but it's also the case that unemployment is a total disaster for your evaluative and your eudaimonic well-being. So there's not much that's worse than unemployment for making you feel unhappy with your life as a whole. So there's this kind of then disjunction between that, but the fact that being at work for people who are in work is terrible. And there's a paper, in fact, in the Economic Journal, dissatisfied with life, but having a good day. You know, you hate being unemployed, but it does mean you get to watch daytime TV, and that compensates, at least in the sort of hedonic account of well-being. And there's a working paper on this available from LSE. So the second question is about cultural activities, and this is with Daniel Fujiwara, who also has affiliations to LSE. And there's a couple of activities in the Mappiness questionnaire that are kind of cultural. You can say that you're at a museum, exhibition, or library, and you can say that you're at a theatre, in a at a dance performance or at a concert. And those are a little bit general, that wasn't the focus. So if you really want to know what the effect of cultural activities is, you might want to do better than those kind of 2 very nebulous categories. But of course, we've got GPS, so we can add to that the geographical extents of top cultural institutions, and we can categorize those in various ways. And so we've got performing arts, visual arts, combined arts, museums, libraries that we've then joined in. And here's an example of, this is the British Museum, as drawn a line round in Google Earth, hopefully accurately, and some responses that appear to be close enough to the British Museum and that say that they're in a museum or library. And the main result from that is that all art forms seem to make people equally happy. These coefficients are, they don't even look different, and they're certainly not statistically different, which in a sense is kind of dull, but also, I guess, sort of nice for all of them. And for museums, I think that's particularly interesting because, museums are no longer charging any money, certainly in London. So there isn't any longer a kind of clear economic welfare measure of how much benefit people are getting. So they could potentially use this kind of thing as a sort of form of valuation tool. Right, the marginal effects are bigger when people are alone. So we also look at kind of, how this interacts with other things that people might be doing. So from a policy point of view, you might say, well, it's more important to get people who are on their own into theatres, but it's still the case that people are in total happier when they're higher with friends. So this basically means people are happier when they're with friends, they're happier when they're doing cultural activities, but the interaction term on those 2 things together is negative, so they're not kind of fully additive. The third thing I'm going to talk about is terrorism, and this is, again, with Alex Bryson from CEP. We have data from the Police Service of Northern Ireland, which we have to keep fairly secure, on terrorism-related incidents, and we have postcode, time, and date for all of those, which is amazing. And then we can see how the impacts of those events vary sort of with the time since they occurred and with the distance from where you live, by the kind of incident that it was. So we have things like deaths, bombings, shootings, and so on. By community of the incident and of the respondents, so sort of and according to expectations, so whether there have been lots of events in this area. We have very preliminary results, so the main thing that we've done so far is actually just join the data sets together and then kind of run a few simple regressions, but so far it seems that the only effects that we see are for deaths, so the other kinds of events don't sort of have a signal in the data that we've got. We see the strongest impacts within about 20 kilometres and sort of actually not immediately, but kind of from 24 hours later and for the next couple of days. And we don't see impacts in the preceding period. So it suggests that it's not kind of a kind of ratcheting up of tension that everyone's aware of. These events seem to be kind of somewhat surprising to people. Obviously, there's a lot more work to be done on this, and expectations. And also, does this sort of depress life satisfaction as a whole. And so there's a question here in the kind of happiness literature often about people getting used to things, adaptation, habituation, and so on. Finally, football, we have an activity that's matches and sporting events. We can join that with the locations of football stadia and the home teams at those stadia. We can join that with data on match dates, who are the home and away teams, what were the results, what were the bookies' odds. And then we should be able to identify supporters, analyse the impacts of expected or unexpected wins and losses, and other things that happen over the course of people's participation. So that's, again, a really nice set of things that can be done with a sort of quite simple data set on well-being with location. There are plans for Mappiness 2, which is that we should cover more countries, we should cover more platforms. I've already coded up a thing for heart rate and HRV, which would be interesting to correlate with this stuff. And also developing a kind of commercial and research platform that hopefully will allow other people to sort of put together studies of this sort more easily with a company. And so that's it. Thank you.
Fascinating, great stuff. So I had one question. You have really nice data, and I wonder, these sort of folk beliefs you might have about sort of reactive happiness, right? Or even the psychological evidence showing that a lot of happiness could be based on contrast. So for example, when you showed people are very happy on Christmas, are they contrastingly less happy just after Christmas? Or for example, if you're happy having sex, does that make you even less happy later on when you're not having sex, for example? So I wonder if you thought about those kinds of things, or...
Yeah, so kind of does a high have a kind of corresponding low at some future period? Yes, and on that note, actually, they've done a little bit of work looking at consuming alcohol, and that's certainly a high that you would expect to have an associated low if you've done enough of it. So I think some of those things are sort of at the level of the data set as a whole. Christmas happens at the same time for everyone, and there isn't an obvious pattern of people then becoming miserable after Christmas. But I guess on the individual level, there is a chance that somebody becoming particularly happy could be followed by low. And I have to say I haven't really done any individual level analysis on the data to date, and that's something that definitely should be done. In fact, that's interesting because that was something that I was talking about with someone last night at dinner, and that was a question that they had too. So yeah, so it's a good question.
Yeah, I was wondering if, so I know we can see graphs about our own personal data, but are we able to access our raw data?
Yes, so actually one of the options on that screen is to download in CSV format, or there in fact is a JSON API where you can kind of consume it all from a web page too.
Great, thank you.
Could I follow up with a question on how income would affect your happiness? And I remember when I was signing up for this app, it asked me what my income was, and it's kind of funny. I quit my job and started a PhD program, but my happiness is actually higher, even though my income basically drops to nothing. So I don't know if if this is something. I know in a panel data with personal fixed effect model, you can really model that, but would you be able to look at income from any other type of models that you're running?
Yeah, so, and economists generally are very interested in this question of, does money make you happy? And, the stylized fact is that it does, and we also find that. So if I run random effects here instead of fixed effects, we get very much the same results, we get slightly larger coefficients, and we do find that having more money on average makes you happier. People do sometimes find in this line of research that actually if you're in the very top income category, you're slightly less happy. So it kind of, it goes up and then it slightly tails off again, possibly for reasons of stress. I mean, yeah, that's an interesting question. I was beginning this as part of my PhD and thinking, well, my income is kind of low, but I don't feel that miserable. I guess sort of expectations of future income, right? There are different ways of having a low income, and it'd be nice if you could explain to mortgage companies, for example, that although the fact you don't have an income now might look bad, you can expect to earn more later than you were earning before, and they don't have any interest in that at all. So it's a little bit complicated, but in general, yes, more income gives you more choices. And as economists would generally say, you can satisfy more of your preferences, and on average, that makes you happier. But I guess the key thing is that you need to be controlling for everything else. You need to be controlling for levels of stress and for other things that go along with higher income.
So I was wondering if you had any statistics about how often the same person basically tells you about their emotional state, and also do they give you more fine-grained information rather than whether they're happy or non-happy?
How do you mean the fine-grained stuff?
For example, there's various categories like the 6 Ekman emotions. and extensions of this set. So I'm wondering whether there's some people who can give you more information than versus the
Right. I mean, so the sort of little video walkthrough that you saw is the sum total of all the questions. So that's all we know. We don't kind of have, and I know that often in psychology, and in fact, one of the things that I had to take out, in fact, it's the next slide in this sequence, I think, is this is a sort of typical classic ESM study, and they ask a lot of questions. You know, lots of these psychological scales have kind of 30 items, and that is really nice. But my big worry was that no one was going to do this, and I thought, well, let's just make it as quick as possible, and that seems to work. So yeah, it would be kind of nice to know a bit more about the emotions. We don't. We just have this kind of happiness and relaxation, which perhaps maps somewhat to the kind of valence and arousal that you might want kind of in a more psychological context. In terms of how often people share stuff, I haven't done as much analysis on that sort of thing as I should. On average, we get about 70 responses over the course of 6 weeks from each person. About half of the time when we beep them, they respond within an hour, which is generally what I count as a kind of valid response. And I suspect that tails off over time, but I need to do more work on characterizing that pattern, really.
Thank you.